Thomas Miller bought a house that did not exist on any map. 3 hours after entering Blackthorn Manor, he discovered a hidden room buried behind an old wall. Inside that room was a photograph of himself as a child, a photograph taken 25 years before he had ever visited the house. But the most disturbing thing was not the picture. It was the diary sitting beside it, a diary written in his own handwriting. And on the first page, only one sentence was written. Thomas, if you are reading this, you have forgotten the truth again. If you enjoy mysterious and supernatural stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with others who love dark mysteries. Thomas Miller never believed in impossible things. Until the day he arrived at Blackthorn Manor in North Yorkshire, England. After losing his wife Eleanor, Thomas left London behind and bought an old Victorian mansion hidden among the lonely hills near Whitby. He wasn't looking for adventure. He was looking for silence. But Blackthorn Manor had been waiting for him. The locals avoided talking about the house. Some said the previous owners left without explanation. Others refused to even walk near the property after sunset. As Thomas drove through the narrow countryside roads, rain covered his windshield and the fog became thicker with every mile. On the passenger seat was an old photograph of the manor from 1930. Thomas picked it up casually. The building looked exactly the same. The same windows, the same stone walls, the same tower reaching above the trees. Then he noticed something that made his hands go cold. Standing beside the front gate was a young boy. A boy with his face. Thomas stared at the photograph for several seconds before placing it back. "That can't be real," he whispered. A few minutes later, Blackthorn Manor appeared through the fog. The Victorian mansion stood alone, surrounded by dark trees and an abandoned garden. As Thomas stepped out of his car, the front door slowly opened. An elderly man stood there holding a lantern. Arthur Whitmore, the previous owner. "You came alone," Arthur said. Thomas looked at him. "I didn't know I needed anyone." Arthur looked past him toward the empty road. "No," he replied. "You didn't." Inside the entrance hall, Arthur handed him the keys. But before leaving, he stopped. "There is something you need to understand." Thomas looked at him. "If you find a door in this house that wasn't there before," Arthur's voice became quieter, "do not open it." Thomas frowned. "Why?" The old man's eyes moved toward the dark hallway behind him. "Because some doors are locked to keep people out." A long pause. "Others are locked to keep something in." Arthur walked away. Thomas stood alone inside Blackthorn Manor. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, something knocked 3 times. Thomas stood frozen inside Blackthorn Manor, listening to the sound disappear into the darkness. For a moment, he convinced himself it was nothing. Old houses made noises, wood expanded, pipes moved. The wind found its way through cracks. That was what he told himself. But then he heard it again. 3 slow knocks. This time, they came from somewhere inside the house. Thomas picked up the lantern Arthur had left behind and stepped deeper into the hallway. The entrance hall of Blackthorn Manor was enormous. A long wooden staircase curved toward the upper floors, while faded paintings covered the walls. Every face in those portraits seemed to be watching him. He stopped in front of one painting, a family portrait. The Whitmore family. Arthur had mentioned nothing about them. Thomas looked closer. There was a young boy standing beside the family. The same boy from the old photograph. The same face. His face. Thomas quickly stepped back. "Who are you?" he whispered. A sudden cold breeze moved through the hallway. The lantern flame shook. Then it went out. Thomas turned around. The darkness behind him felt heavier than before. Using his phone flashlight, he searched for the electrical panel. He moved through several rooms, opening doors and checking the old walls. Then he noticed something strange. A hallway he had not seen before. Thomas stopped. The house layout made no sense. He had studied the property documents before buying Blackthorn Manor. This corridor was impossible. At the end of it stood a wooden door, a door that looked much newer than the rest of the house. Thomas slowly walked toward it. His hand moved closer to the handle. Then he remembered Arthur's warning. "Do not open it." Thomas pulled his hand back. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he noticed something carved into the wood. 2 words. His name. Oh, Mass Miller. His breathing became slow. Someone had carved his name into a door inside a house he had entered for the first time today. A sound came from the other side. Not knocking this time. A whisper. "You're late." Thomas stepped away. The logical part of his mind told him to leave. To call Arthur. To walk out of the house and never return. But another part of him wanted answers. He grabbed the handle. The moment he touched it, a strange feeling passed through him. A smell. A memory. Freshly cut grass. Old books. His mother's perfume. A childhood he had not thought about in years. The lock clicked open by itself. Thomas pushed the door slowly, and behind it was a room that should not have existed. The room that should not have existed was waiting for him. Thomas stood at the doorway, unable to move. For several seconds, he forgot how to breathe. The room was not dark like the rest of Blackthorn Manor. It was warm, familiar, almost comforting. And that was what frightened him the most. Because this was not a random room. This was his childhood bedroom. The faded blue wallpaper, the wooden shelf beside the window, the small desk where he used to draw for hours, even the old toy train sitting on the floor near the bed. Thomas slowly stepped inside. His eyes moved around the room, searching for any explanation. No. The word escaped his mouth quietly. Because the toy train had disappeared when he was 8 years old. He remembered crying for days after losing it. His parents told him it was gone forever. But now it was sitting exactly where he had left it, untouched, waiting. Thomas picked it up. Dust covered everything in the room except that toy, as if someone had placed it there moments ago. A noise behind him made him turn. The door was still open. The hallway outside was empty. Thomas walked back and looked at the doorframe. There was no sign of the strange hallway anymore. Only his bedroom, only his past. A small wooden table stood beside the window. On it was a black leather diary. Thomas knew before touching it that something was wrong. He had never seen the diary before, but somehow he recognized it. He opened the cover. The first page was blank. The second page was blank. Then, on the third page, words appeared, not written in ink, not written by a hand. They slowly formed across the paper. Thomas Miller. He dropped the diary onto the table. His heart started racing. A few seconds passed, then more words appeared. You always forget this room. Thomas stepped back. The room suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed closer. He looked toward the window. Outside was not the dark garden of Blackthorn Manor. Outside was his old childhood home. The house where he grew up. The house he had not seen in almost 30 years. A child's voice came from behind him. Why did you leave me here? Thomas turned. Nobody was there. But on the bed was something new. A photograph. He picked it up with shaking hands. It showed a younger version of himself standing in front of Blackthorn Manor. Beside him was another child, a boy holding the same toy train. On the back of the photograph was a date, 26, and a message written in handwriting Thomas recognized, his own handwriting. "Don't let him open the door again." Thomas stared at the sentence. Then he heard footsteps outside the room. Slow footsteps, coming closer. Someone was walking down the impossible hallway toward him, and then a voice spoke from the other side of the door. "Thomas." A pause. "You weren't supposed to remember yet." The voice outside the door made Thomas freeze. He knew that voice, but he couldn't understand why. It sounded older, tired, almost like someone who had been waiting years to speak to him. Thomas slowly moved toward the door. "Who is there?" No answer, only silence. Then the door opened by itself. The hallway of Blackthorn Manor was back. The childhood bedroom was gone. Thomas stepped outside, holding the photograph tightly in his hand. The impossible hallway stretched in front of him again. But something had changed. The walls were no longer empty. Old photographs covered them from floor to ceiling, hundreds of them. Thomas walked closer. Each photograph showed moments from his life. His first day at school, his graduation, his wedding with Eleanor. But there was one problem. Every photograph had something different, small changes, things that never happened. In one picture, Eleanor was standing beside him with a child Thomas had never seen before. His hands became cold. "Who is doing this?" His voice disappeared into the hallway. Then a woman's voice answered. "Not who." Thomas turned quickly. At the end of the corridor stood Clara Whitmore, Arthur's daughter. She looked exactly like someone who had been searching for this moment for years. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Thomas stared at her. "How did you get inside?" Clara ignored the question. Her eyes moved to the photograph in his hand. "Where did you find that?" "In the room." Her expression changed. "The room opened for you." Thomas stepped closer. "What is this place?" Clara looked around the hallway. "This house doesn't create rooms." She paused. "It creates memories." Thomas shook his head. "That doesn't make sense." Clara gave a small, bitter smile. "That's what everyone says the first time." She walked toward him slowly. "My father told you not to open the door, didn't he?" Thomas said nothing. Clara looked at the photograph again. "You have already seen too much." "Seen what?" Clara stopped. "The first time you came here." Thomas stared at her. "I've never been here before." Clara looked at him with sadness. "That's what the room wanted you to believe." The hallway lights flickered. For a moment, the walls disappeared. Thomas saw another memory. A younger version of himself standing inside Blackthorn Manor. A child, scared, holding the same toy train, standing beside a woman who looked like his mother. Then the vision vanished. Thomas grabbed the wall. "What was that?" Clara's voice became quieter. 25 years ago, your family came to this house." "My family?" "Your parents knew about this place." Thomas looked at her. "Why don't I remember?" Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed toward the end of the hallway. A new door had appeared. Unlike the first one, this door looked old, very old, and carved into it were 4 words: "The memory you lost." Thomas took a step forward. Clara grabbed his arm. "Don't." He looked at her. "Why?" Her eyes filled with fear. "Because the room doesn't show you what happened." A pause. "It shows you what you were made to forget." Before Thomas could respond, the door at the end of the hallway slowly began to open. Disclaimer: This story is a fictional mystery inspired by the real history of Victorian-era homes in the United Kingdom. During the Victorian period, 1837 to 1901, many grand houses, manors, and country estates were built across England. These homes often contained hidden features such as servant staircases, concealed storage spaces, private libraries, secret passages, and rooms designed for specific family purposes. Over time, many of these historic properties developed legends and local stories because of their age, unusual architecture, and the secrets left behind by generations of residents. This fictional story takes inspiration from that real historical atmosphere. However, the characters, Blackthorn Manor, Thomas Miller, the Impossible Room, and all supernatural events shown in this story are fictional and created for entertainment purposes. No real person, family, or documented historical event is connected to the events portrayed in this story. Now, with that said, let's move to the story. The door at the end of the hallway slowly began to open. Thomas stared at the darkness behind it. Clara still held his arm. "Don't go in there," she whispered. But Thomas looked at the words carved into the door. "The memory you lost." For years, he had carried questions he never had answers for. Why could he not remember parts of his childhood? Why did certain places feel familiar when he had never been there? Why did Eleanor spend months researching Blackthorn Manor before her death? He gently removed Clara's hand. "I need to know." Clara looked away. "That's exactly what everyone says." Thomas stepped toward the door. The moment he crossed the threshold, the hallway disappeared. He was no longer inside Blackthorn Manor. He was standing in a garden. A familiar garden. The air smelled like rain and freshly cut grass. Thomas looked around. Then he saw the house. His childhood home. A memory. But not the one he remembered. A younger Thomas, around 10 years old, was standing near the garden fence. Beside him was another boy, the same boy from the photographs. The same face. His face. The younger Thomas was holding the toy train. "You promised you wouldn't tell anyone," the other boy said. Thomas watched silently. He knew this memory, but he had never lived it. The younger version of himself looked scared. "I don't want to go back there." The other boy pointed toward the trees. "You have to. The room is waiting." Thomas felt a sudden pain in his head. The scene changed. Now he was inside Blackthorn Manor. A younger version of himself stood in front of the impossible door. But he was not alone. His parents were there, and they were arguing. "We can't keep hiding this," his mother said. His father looked terrified. "Do you understand what happens if he remembers?" Thomas moved closer. "Remember what?" Nobody heard him. Nobody saw him. The memory continued. His younger self opened the door. A bright light filled the hallway. Then everything went silent. The vision changed again. Thomas was back in the room, but this time, someone was sitting beside the window. Eleanor. His wife. Alive. Thomas stopped breathing. "Eleanor?" She slowly turned toward him. Her face was calm, but her eyes were filled with sadness. "You finally came back." Thomas moved closer. "This isn't real." Eleanor looked at the room around them. "That is the question, isn't it?" Thomas felt tears building in his eyes. "You knew about this place." She nodded. "I found out before you did." "Why didn't you tell me?" Eleanor looked down. "Because the truth was the one thing this room could use against you." Thomas stepped closer. "What truth?" Eleanor looked directly at him. "You didn't forget what happened here, Thomas." A pause. You chose to forget. The room became colder. The walls started changing. The childhood bedroom faded away. Eleanor's voice became distant. You need to remember why you came here the first time. Thomas reached toward her, but she disappeared. On the table in front of him, the black diary opened by itself. A new sentence appeared on the page. The boy you saw was not your brother. Thomas stared at the words. Then another line slowly appeared. He was the part of you that stayed behind. For several seconds he couldn't move. The room around him had stopped changing. No whispers, no footsteps, no strange sounds from the walls. Only silence. The kind of silence that comes when a person finally reaches the truth they spent years running from. Thomas slowly closed the diary. What are you? He whispered. The room gave no answer. Instead, the old wooden door behind him opened. Beyond it was not the hallway of Blackthorn Manor. It was a different place, a small room from his childhood. But this time, Thomas remembered. He remembered the night his parents brought him to the manor. He remembered the fear on their faces. He remembered the boy standing beside him, the boy who looked exactly like him. But now, he understood. The boy was not another child. It was a memory, a piece of himself, the part of Thomas that had stayed inside the room when he escaped, the part that carried the truth, the part that remembered everything. A voice came from behind him. Now you understand? Thomas turned. Arthur Whitmore stood near the doorway, older, tired, but no longer afraid. You knew, Thomas said. Arthur lowered his eyes. I knew the room would find you eventually. Why me? Arthur looked toward the walls. Because some memories don't disappear, Thomas. A pause. They wait. Thomas looked back at the room. The objects around him began fading. The old toy train, the childhood photographs, the diary. Everything was disappearing. What's happening? Arthur answered quietly. The room is giving you a choice. The air became colder. On the table appeared two doors. One was made of old wood. The other was covered in cracks. Arthur pointed toward them. The first door lets you leave with the life you remember. Thomas looked at the second door. And the other? Arthur hesitated. The other gives you the truth. Omar stepped closer. Behind the cracked door, he could hear a familiar voice. Eleanor. Thomas? His heart stopped. For months, he had wanted one more conversation with her. One more chance. But he knew this room. It never gave anything freely. Thomas placed his hand on the door. The moment he touched it, the entire house shook. Somewhere inside Blackthorn Manor, another door opened. A door that was never there before. And this time, someone else was standing in front of it. Thomas looked through the fading walls of the memory room, unable to understand what he was seeing. The figure on the other side was a man, older, tired, holding a lantern in his hand. Thomas felt his heart stop, because the man was him. Not a reflection, not a memory. Him. The older version of Thomas stared back through the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the older Thomas said, You finally remembered. The room fell silent. Thomas stepped closer. Who are you? The older man looked at the walls around them. The person who failed to stop you from coming here. Thomas shook his head. This isn't possible. A faint smile appeared on the older man's face. That is what I said too. The room began changing again. The walls shifted. The floor disappeared. Thomas found himself standing in the center of Blackthorn Manor's entrance hall. But everything was different. The house was alive. People were walking through the halls, families laughing, children running. The manor was no longer abandoned. It was showing him the past. Then Thomas saw Eleanor. She was standing near the staircase, alive, holding the same diary. His breath caught. She turned toward someone beside her, the younger Thomas. "I don't understand," Thomas whispered. The older version of himself appeared beside him. "The room doesn't create memories." He looked at Eleanor. "It preserves them." Thomas looked at him. Then why did Eleanor die? The older Thomas became quiet. Because she discovered what the room really was. A pause. And she tried to destroy it. Thomas watched as the memory continued. Eleanor placed the diary inside the room. On the final page, she wrote, "If Thomas finds this, it means I failed to protect him." Thomas felt his chest tighten. The older man looked at him. "She knew the room would eventually call you back?" "Why?" "Because the room was never connected to the house." He pointed toward Thomas. "It was connected to you." The walls started cracking. The entire manor began disappearing. Thomas looked toward the two doors that had appeared earlier, the door of memories and the door of truth. Now he understood. The room wasn't trapping him. It was waiting for him to decide who he wanted to become. Thomas walked toward the door of truth. Behind it were all the memories he had lost. The pain, the fear, the night that changed everything. He opened it. A wave of memories rushed through him. And finally, Thomas remembered. He had not lost his past. He had sacrificed it. Because that night, he chose to leave a part of himself behind so he could survive. The room had kept that part safe until he was ready. The next moment, Thomas opened his eyes. He was standing inside Blackthorn Manor. The impossible hallway was gone. The mysterious door had disappeared. Morning light entered through the old windows. Arthur Whitmore stood nearby. "You remember now?" Thomas looked around the house. "Everything." Arthur nodded. Then he handed him the old diary. But when Thomas opened it, there was only one new sentence. "Every house remembers the people who leave it." Months later, Blackthorn Manor was sold again. The new owners arrived on a cold evening in Yorkshire. They noticed something strange while unpacking. A door at the end of the hallway. A door that was not on the house plans. Behind it was a small room. Inside the room was a wooden table. On the table was a diary. The first page was blank, until the ink slowly appeared. A new name was written. Not Thomas Miller, someone else. And beneath it, one sentence appeared. "You always forget the first time you came here.